Shemai, Jasmine. It's so lovely of you to talk to me about your writing and your inspirations. And I wanted to start this conversation with birdsplaining and natural history. Your remarkable collection of essays on how an androcentric view of birds defines the natural history of the species, published in 2021 by the New Welsh Review. The book is more than just natural history, though. It coagulates nature with anthropomorphism, the physical experience of being a woman, imperialism, gender roles, and more. How did birdsplaining come about?
Oh, how did it come about? Well, I've told the story several times about how I ended up submitting a piece of work to the New Welsh Writing Award. I had been struggling to get some things published. I had had a number of disappointments. I'd written a novel that had not got any traction. I'd applied for multiple forms of funding and not been successful, and I had a real loss of confidence. And I guess I saw the advertisement, I think, for the competition, and I thought, well, I'll use it to finish a piece of work. At least it'll be a structure for me to actually get something done. And so I did that, and then the deadline came around, and it was very close to the deadline, and I didn't like what I had written, but I thought, well, I'm going to send it in anyway, and it won, and I was very taken aback by that. And then how birdsplaining itself came about was developing that shorter piece of work into a long collection of essays. I think there were 3 or 5 essays in the competition piece, which also got reworked. So it was the development of a number of things I had been thinking about and kind of writing my way around for a while. But a good part of it was written in the aftermath of winning that competition, and then having a structure in which to sort of develop some of my thinking. And it didn't go in the direction I expected it to at all. I expected it to be much more memoir, and it ended up being much more natural history, and obviously not only birds. And there were themes in it that were a little unexpected. But yeah, that was the origin of it, and ended up being quite a different book. Actually, somebody pointed out my first poetry collection was full of birds, and in fact, quite apart from the body and the land and the physicality of the poems in Self-Portrait as Ruth, there are also a lot of birds. I think the natural world, particularly birds, is also a theme, a way of exploring things, which then I focused on in birdsplaining. And I guess it was also quite a major part of Losing Israel was birds. I remember somebody at an event I did, where I did a reading of Losing Israel, somebody said to me afterwards, "Why birds? Why birds?" And I couldn't answer, because birds are so fundamental to how I navigate in the world that I couldn't understand for a moment how to answer why birds, because there is no why birds just are. So this poem is called Migrants. What is he searching for that I'm searching for? I've tried to be free of his rhythm. I've tried and failed to see a pattern that is not shame. I've pored over the distribution maps, the lines of migration, the isogloss boundaries. I've smoothed the glossy covers of the field guides. I've listened to their song. They've gathered on the lines. I've heard them going over, going home. And the he in that poem is David Jones. The poem Domine Deus, which I just obsessed with that poem. It echoed in my mind. It's just the extraordinary imagery in that poem, which I don't understand at all. It's Catholic imagery, and it's a mystery to me. But just the descriptions, the weirdness of that poem, and its sort of obsessive, repeated rhythm. Yeah, that's what that poem was a response to. But also birds, also people, different, rather topical question about migration, I guess.
Pleading to pour backwards what it gathers from without, or touching here, with words, with desire. Now I don't know if I will get the title right, but I'll have a go at it. Your poem Lashon Horror sits alongside a set of rich, provocative and stunning body of verse in your second poetry collection, Self-Portrait as Ruth, published by Parthian Books. The collection is a defiance against the official version of the Israeli and Palestinian history, a defiance against the traditionally written identity of womanhood, challenging the physicality of desire, morality and more. I wanted to know more about these poems, if I may.
It's interesting to revisit the collection. It was originally published by Salt in 2009, and that was a great surprise because I had sent it out and I got the call from the editor, the director then of Salt, that he wanted to take it, and I was absolutely delighted. I remember I was at work and I think I screamed with delight. And one of my colleagues came running in, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes, I'm great." And then it turned out another publisher that I had sent it to had understood that that he had accepted it, even though he hadn't said he was accepting it. He had said he was interested, and so I had to tell him no, sorry, Salt has got it. So that was very exciting. I've been revisiting it recently, partly in light of what's happening in Gaza now, which I have been almost entirely unable to write about. I just feel unable to write very much at all at the moment. And that book had its roots in the war in Gaza in 2006. So there's a horrible kind of continuity or return there. And that war, by comparison, was nothing compared to what's going on now. And yet at the time, it seemed the worst it could be, and it was urgent then to write about it, as it's urgent now to write about Gaza. And somehow I found something to say, and I read back and I can see that urgency, and I think that's both, I suppose, an energizing factor in the poems, but I think that's also perhaps a weakness in the poems. They're very raw. I think they're, I see the flaws in them. There was a lot of passion and a sense that I could say something, whereas now I just feel a complete failure of language every time I approach the question. So yes, that was the sort of the background to it. I think those poems were written in a fairly short space of time, when I was completely reassessing my own relationship with Israel, which is where my mother's from, and my own sense of my past, my family past, my sense of identity. And the way that I found to explore this question of conflicting narratives, of mutually exclusive narratives, encountering the other narrative, and it being completely irreconcilable with the narrative that I had grown up with. My way of exploring that was physicality. The body as an image of the land in some way, and the land as a body. It was that. So it's a very sexualized collection of poems. It's very, very physical, very sensual, and that's where a lot of its flaws lie, I think. But I think that's also where a lot of the the energy in the writing came from. So I'll read Lashon Hora, which you quoted from with one of your questions. Lashon Hora is Hebrew for evil tongue, talking about other people. There's a whole sort of constellation of related meanings and traditions, but that's what the words actually mean. Lashon Hora. To speak of it at all, his tongue with its 7 predilections and deceits, is to speak Lashon Hora. Pleating to pour backwards what it gathers from without, or touching here, with words, with desire, to speak of it at all, what the tongue said, what the tongue did, is to speak Lashon Hora. The messenger journeyed for years through red deserts, remnants, always hoping he might return to Jerusalem in time for Yom Kippur. He started among ruined mud houses whose empty rooms lay untouched, chairs overturned, blankets thrown back as if someone had just scrambled out of bed. He joined for a while the trail of refugees, balancing bales of belongings on their heads. He can never sleep. As soon as he lies down, the parts of his body begin their dispute. Homesick, he can almost smell it, the market on Old Nablus Road, shishlik sellers out shouting each other, buses idling in the dark fog of their own exhaust. The parts of his body are repeating their boasts, the scribes' marginalia that the rabbis leave out, the bowels threatening to proclaim a work stoppage. We're tired of you lot treating us like shit. The penis beginning its psychotic cackle. It's not even a question who's in control here. But the tongue keeps stum, not rising to the clamour of contempt when it made the quiet claim, I rule the body. It has declared its intent. At last he stumbles home. Outside the Jaffa gate they call, where in the world have you been? And he tells them about his journey, what he's heard, what he's seen. But the rabbis say, you must not listen to a loosened tongue. Even the desire to hear of what his tongue said, what his tongue did, with its 7 predilections and deceits, is to commit Lashon Hora.
I just wanted to ask about Self-Portrait as Ruth being first published by Salt, I think you mentioned, in 2009, and then it was republished by Parthian Books again. And also tying into that, you talked about kind of revisiting this conflicting narrative. I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more about that as well, please.
Yes, the book was republished, in a new edition by Parthian. Salt went through a crisis, and they ditched all their poetry. I'm very grateful to Parthian for bringing it out again. In terms of the conflicting narratives, I mean, it's never not been topical in some way, that particular concern that I was exploring in that book, and then of course I explored in much greater detail in my non-fiction work, Losing Israel, which was a memoir, and it looked at family history in more detail and conflicting narratives in more detail. I think perhaps it's one of the reasons that I am finding it very difficult to write about the subject now, is because there is such a polarized, absolutely polarized approach to understanding what's happening, that it's not really possible. It doesn't feel possible to explore the nuances of what people think and feel and believe and have been told, and which are so utterly in conflict with one another, and so how can they kind of coexist? I don't mean the rights and wrongs of the situation. I mean how people attach themselves to one narrative or the other narrative. And so, I mean, that's been something that I'm sort of putting my energy into in other ways. I've been exploring conflict resolution and become trained as a mediator, and I've been doing all these other conflict-related things that aren't about writing, but feel like they address that same problem. And I'm really hopeful that there will be an opportunity again to make space for talking, writing, reading, hearing across these polarized understandings, so that we can still see people who we disagree with as fellow humans, even if we disagree with them. So yes, it was I think the energy of discovering the other narrative, and a lot of people don't believe that I didn't know the other narrative, that how could I possibly have grown up without knowing about the Palestinian story? And yet that's exactly what I grew up with. Somebody my age, 57, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, before the first Intifada, there were these very strongly segregated stories and segregated communities, and I think it's very hard to imagine what that was like to not know, and to not know to even question the story that I had grown up with. And yet that's how it was. So the energy of discovering the other narrative and being so shocked by what I hadn't known, and how these two versions of the past could both be true for the people who held those views. I think that gave me a really strong way to explore the things that I explore in the collection. In the absence of that, you know, in the presence of just this sense of grief, I suppose, and dismay, and sense of this inadequacy of language, I don't know how to write about it. So I haven't been writing about it. Although there was the very beginning of a poem recently, first poem in a while. So maybe that's the way in again. I don't know. We'll see. So I'll read the poem Palestina, which touches on this question of contradictory narratives, mutually exclusive narratives, and how you can approach versions of the past that contradict each other, that conflict with one another. Palestina. She slipped past when the border guard had fallen asleep at his post. She smelt of sweat and olive wood. One finger pressed against my mouth, she whispered, "Here's where it began, your words, 1,000 years ago, claiming my heart is in the east." She took off her dress. Her body was a map of my body. Where she had scars, I had scars. I traced her terrain, the ruined watchtowers where the gunmen had lain, the wadi where I'd watched a short-toed eagle soar above the rusted vans, and in my heart I butchered Chernikovsky's glorifying refrain, claiming my mountains, mine. I knew she'd never let me alone again. "My womb is not your womb," she said. "I give birth to blood and shards of bone." She lay down, the length of her body against my body, and kissed me with my mouth, telling me in my voice, "Here's where the catastrophe began. Your words, your claim, my heart is in the east."
I wanted to ask about your first poetry collection, Misappropriations, which had been nominated for several awards, and I think it was also published by Parthian Books. How did this poetry collection begin? And I wanted to kind of ask you about how poetry began and led to this collection.
That's it's interesting thinking back. Yes, that was my first poetry collection, and yes, it was Parthian. It's my first book, 2006. And it pulled together poems that I had written in one form or another over quite a long period before that, some of which had probably been written when I was still living in the States. I moved here in 2002, and I'd been living in California for 12 years before that, which is where poetry began for me. I dropped out. I didn't do my A-levels. I ran away to Israel when I was 17. So when I moved to California, I had this opportunity to attend community college and start my education in that way. So I did evening courses for, I don't know, 6-7 years, and then finally got an Associate of Arts, a 2-year degree. And one of the classes I did was a poetry class in San Francisco Community College. And I'd written a few poems. I remember when I lived in London briefly when I was 17, 18, 19, and I remember writing some very, very depressive, extraordinarily depressive poems then, living on the dole and being pretty clueless about what I was doing with my life. But yes, in California, I started writing more, and it sort of developed from there. That was the form that I was writing in, and then I took more evening classes. I joined a writing group. I was taught by Joseph Millar in Berkeley, I think, but Berkeley Community College as it's now called, and Dorian Locks. I was very fortunate in my poetry teachers, and then I transferred to UC Berkeley, and I did a degree in Celtic Studies, but I also managed to take a couple of poetry classes. One with Tom Gunn, the last semester that he was teaching, and one with Robert Hass, who 2-time poet laureate, and they were just incredible teachers. They were encouraged me and took me seriously as a poet. I won a couple of prizes. I got a couple of poems published. So that was sort of the beginning, and really to discover that California tradition of poetry, which is, I suppose, people call it confessional. I don't particularly like the term confessional, though I don't have that much of a problem with it. I think some poets who get called confessional object to it. I think the one place I suppose I would object to it is that the confessional term seems to reinforce, unfortunately, this notion that the speaker of a poem is the poet, and that it's autobiographical rather than it's the speaker of the poem. And that's an assumption that I just come up against again and again. And with Self-Portrait as Ruth, it's a really good example of the speaker of the poem is not necessarily the poet. So I think that's a bit of a problem with the term confessional. But that was the kind of environment in California, and it was a different sort of poetry. There was a certain amount of exploring personal trauma, as we call it now. I don't know what we called it then. So there was a certain amount of personal, autobiographical, exploratory writing. But I sort of found a way through that, pulling together a certain English sensibility. I think I mean English. I mean, I grew up in England, and I read, as a teenager, I suppose I read English poets. But then to read American poets, that just completely changed things for me. Some of Galway Kinnell, James Wright, poets whose work I still refer back to when I forget what poetry means to me, and then I read something by Galway Kinnell and I'm reminded. So that's kind of the background. And then when I moved here, I continued to write poems. I had a few poems published. I put together a collection, submitted it to Parthian, and Richard Gwynne was then the poetry editor, and he called me and he said, I'm leaving Parthian, and but I want to publish your collection, but I'm leaving, and I've suggested to Rich, the director, that you might be a good person to take over as poetry editor. So that's in fact what happened. So I had to make sure that the collection came out before I started, because otherwise it would look quite erroneously as though I had selected my own collection as the very first collection that we published, which would have been a real mistake. So that's how that collection came about, and it was shortlisted, I think, for the Jerwood First Collection Prize. And yes, that's right, yeah, and got reviews in surprising places. So it was very affirming. It was very encouraging, and I continued with the second collection. I some years later. But that it's always worth remembering where that came from, because I do lose track, and I think teaching poetry for years has been really detrimental to me writing poetry. So I think that's partly why it's something I've not been writing in recent years.
At this year's Aberystwyth Poetry Festival, you read some new poems. So I'm wondering, if there's maybe perhaps, are you working along some themes or working along some poems towards a new book at some point, maybe?
Possibly. I mean, I go back and forth. I mean, the being invited to read at the Aberystwyth Poetry Festival was a good stimulus, because I did look back through what I have written over the intervening years, none of which is I think 2 poems have been published in the interim, maybe 3. And I do have sort of the makings of a collection that I return to now and again and think, is this something is there anything here? Is there not anything here? And I'm still not sure, but it's about the body. The working title is the Middle Ages, about being middle-aged, perimenopause, postmenopause, those sorts of themes. And I suppose there is something of a moment for that subject, but I don't know. What's missing for me is this sense of that I have anything very interesting or worthwhile to say, and I don't know. I'll have to see.
I wanted to ask, as an academic and teacher of creative writing, with many writers to name who have benefited from your tutelage, if teaching how to write has shaped your own practice?
Yes, I think in a way, in 2 ways it has. I think it's made it harder to write in some ways, in the way that working as an editor also makes it harder to write, because you've got other people's voices, other people's concerns, frames of reference in your mind, if you're engaged. I think that's particularly true with PhD supervision, where you have an ongoing relationship with your PhD students developing texts. But it's also true, particularly with teaching poetry, and I found that at the MA level, because it's a very intense workshop situation, and so on one level I think it was detrimental to me writing poetry. I'm no longer teaching, So in one way I feel that it was detrimental. But of course in other ways you're constantly having to reflect on what how do you teach this form that has no form? How do you teach this question of craft? How do you judge? And certainly it's something students constantly asked and constantly challenged. How do you judge quality? How do you mark? And I think one of the things that I have most enjoyed about teaching, and that I have taken on into my new mentoring practice, is not the teaching of craft as such, which has never particularly interested me, but the ways in which you can try to help facilitate somebody's own use of language, their own particular strengths, their own inclinations. Obviously challenge them as well, but that tired old phrase, to help somebody find their own voice. But there's truth in that too, that it's I think my most rewarding teaching moments have been those moments where I've actually stepped back, where I've been able to create some kind of environment where the writer, the student, has discovered something in their own writing and has felt something shift, has had a realization, and has kind of run with the thing that they're writing, and it's taken off. And that's not teaching craft. It is also to do with helping writers find their own way of learning to trust their instincts as a writer. And like I say, there's also part of that is challenging the worst instincts, perhaps an instinct towards flat language or repetition or not taking risks. But there are also really, really strong instincts that I think every emerging writer has, and yet they don't necessarily trust them, just as I, as an emerging writer, didn't particularly trust what was my instinct, what was made up of my own experience and language and inherited frame of reference and cultural associations and all of those things. So yeah, the most rewarding thing wasn't actually teaching, it was that kind of facilitation, I think. And in that sense, again, I think that helps shape my own writing, in the sense that if I'm trying to enable that for other people, how can I also try and enable that for my own writing? I can't say that I totally trust my instincts, but I'm better, the longer I've been writing, the better I've got at recognizing where I'm getting in my own way. I have all the same doubts, I have all the same losses of confidence, all the same sense of being an imposter and everything else, and writing something exciting and then reading it the next day and it's shit, and not ever wanting to write again, and then trying again. All of those things, they never go away. But I think what I do know better is to recognize them, to say, oh yeah, I've seen you before, you can make your noise, but you're not stopping me from keeping going.
Whose People, Wales, Israel, Palestine. Your 2012 monograph, published by the University of Wales Press, explores Wales's own long history with the Near East and Jewishness. I wanted to ask about how your identity as a Jewish woman has shaped your writing.
It's a little bit like the question why birds, in a way. I mean, in the sense that the birds were just this unconscious, unquestioned part of who I was, and being Jewish in some ways has been that. But But it wasn't till I was older that I suppose I began to understand that what I meant by being Jewish was very different from what some other people meant by being Jewish. My own experience of being Jewish was very much being the daughter of an Israeli. I didn't grow up with Jewish tradition or being part of any Jewish community. I don't think I even really knew any Jews in the first few years of my life. Didn't have extended Jewish family. So all of these kind of tropes of Jewishness that will be familiar in literature, particularly American Jewish literature, were things I knew about from reading, not from my background. And yet being Jewish was always just part of who I was, and very much being Jewish was experientially was being an ethnic minority, was tied up with being brown and being very much a minority where I lived and being identified that way. And it was very interesting then to be in the States and in a place where to be Jewish was an entirely different definition. It was a different kind of identity. So how has it shaped my writing? Well, it's shaped my writing in the sense of it just shaping who I am, but it's also been a particular interest as a research subject, less so recently. I feel there's less appetite now, the least possible appetite now, for overtly Jewish writing. I think that the Israeli government and Israeli army's actions have created an environment in which it's very hard to be a Jewish writer in the UK now, both in practical terms, getting published, but also in subject matter terms. I just don't think that there's an appetite there's an interest in Jewish experience right now because of that conflation that's happened. It's very hard to consider Jewishness separate from Israel, even if experientially one's Jewishness is entirely separate from Israel. Other people's perceptions conflate the two. So I think there's always for me been a consciousness of the reception of me as a writer, as a Jewish writer, and my writing as in some way Jewish writing, even if it's not explicitly about a Jewish subject. And that's never been more apparent than now. In terms of sort of the literary shaping, I mean, I suppose I have probably read, I probably have a fairly deep immersion in Jewish writing as part of my research, but also fiction, which wasn't particularly part of my research, my PhD research, and then subsequently my academic publications. But some of that is in some ways more to do with my awareness of how that differs from my own experience of being Jewish. I'm not sure I'm answering the question about how it's shaped my writing as such, but it's shaped my sense of self, which I guess shapes my writing. And it certainly shaped the subject matter of my research and my academic and my non-fiction research. But for example, I don't think it has any bearing on my writing about the natural world or about birds. My interest in birds is just a family background that's nothing to do with being Jewish. So, except, I guess, with the exception that I would say there is a kind of a stereotype of Jewish culture as being urban and communal and divorced from the natural world. And it's true that there isn't nearly as much Jewish writing by Jewish authors about the natural world as there is about various forms of the human world. But there are plenty of exquisite writers about the natural world, and particularly about birds, by Jewish authors. There's some exquisite Jewish writing about the natural world. So that's a very roundabout answer to your question.
And finally, I wanted to ask if you are working on anything exciting at present.
Well, I don't know if it's exciting, but it's exciting for me. But it's something I've been working on for a long time, which is, I'm not going to say it's a book because I don't know if it will be a book, but it's an exploration of the writings of H.B. Tristram, English naturalist from Durham, who spent a lot of time in Palestine between 1858 and even into 1903 or 1906, I think. Anyway, repeated returns. He was a naturalist, collector of bird eggs and shooter of birds, collector of bird skins, and an expert on the birds of Palestine, and also a major figure in the establishment of ornithological institutions in Britain. So a really important figure, but he's also just this very engaging travel writer. And I've been trying to work out how to write about him, and I've tried many different approaches, and I think I've found the approach, and it's quite exciting. And I've just got some documentary evidence that I'm very excited about exploring and investigating. So that's where the energy is. I'm noticing that I'm using the word energy a lot. That seems to be a theme in what I'm talking about today, which must be a stand-in for interest and excitement. I'm excited about this subject matter, and I'm excited to feel like I maybe have a way forward with it. So on the subject of Tristram, who I'm writing about now, I've also written about him a fair amount in bits and pieces. He turns up in my book Losing Israel. I can't recall whether he's in Self-Portrait as Ruth. If he isn't named in Self-Portrait as Ruth, he's certainly there in some form. There's Tristram Scrackles, I think, in Self-Portrait as Ruth. He's just been a presence since I was a young child, because my father had his books and loved him. So I've done quite a lot of research already on him. So here's a section from an essay about naming conventions, about bird naming conventions, and the kinds of colonial thefts, a soft kind of colonialism in how we name other species and so-called discoveries. So I'll read a section from this. The basement archives of the Liverpool World Museum are cool and dim. It's a sultry day in July, humid and thundery, and the air conditioning is not working in the hotel where I'm staying. So it's a relief to sit here in the cool air, waiting for my first sight of the birds shot in Palestine by the English naturalist Henry Baker Tristram. The collection that he sold to the Liverpool Museum in 1896 numbered more than 20,000 skins, and although some were lost during the Second World War, most of that early collection was preserved. Others, including the more than 24,000 eggs he collected, ended up in the Natural History Museum at Tring and elsewhere in the UK and the US. It's hard to imagine the sheer volume of birds that used to fill the sky and land in the 19th century when Tristram was compiling his collections, just as perhaps it'll be hard for a child growing up now to imagine the volume of insects that used to fly in our living memory over a hay meadow or above a river. Tristram was known as the Great Gun of Durham, a nickname that surely contributed to him being described as one of the great sportsmen and bird slaughterers of the late 19th and early 20th century. But as Tristram's biographer points out, the Great Gun of Durham was a punning nickname conferred by a friend on the occasion of Tristram being made canon of Durham Cathedral. Nevertheless, although Tristram was not indiscriminate in his shooting of birds, the acquisition by the Liverpool Museum of this collection of more than 20,000 bird skins indicates the sheer scale of his collecting, some of it through trade and purchase, but the vast majority of it by his own gun or by the guns of those whom he paid what he disparagingly called bakshish. The oldest birds in the collection are a male and female Tristram's grackle, now more commonly referred to as Tristram's starling. It's probably the best known bird that carries Tristram's name because it is present in noisy abundance at Masada, one of the prime tourist sites in Israel, and a prime birdwatching site during the migration season. Shot near the Dead Sea in 1858, the two grackles in the Liverpool collection are mere skin and feathers, beak and feet, the empty eye sockets shriveled. The female's brown feathers are a little faded and the glossy black feathers of the male are dull. In both, the distinctive orange wing feathers have turned brown with age. Behind me in the archives, there are drawers and drawers full of the other birds he shot. Some 17,000 of them, each in a protective cellophane wrapper, each with a tag tied to its leg, giving its name, sex, and the location and date it was shot, written in faded ink in Tristram's hand.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for talking to me about your writings and your inspirations.
Thank you for having me.